I should clarify one thing, which is that companies like and experts like IKE, they have been doing this transition for several years, starting already before the legislation actually required it. So that the legislation, for example, for PFOA, came into force in 2020, where it was required. We knew that the phase-out schedule, that by the early July 2025, you will have to remove away from PFOA containing foams. And basically what that leads to is that companies who have these foams have been forced to start the transition process, but we haven't been doing very well in defining like what do you have to do in that transition process, how well do you have to clean, and so on. And we are coming up with that really late. So I referred to this earlier, but we have likely a new amendment on the PFOA entry in POPs regulation entering into force in a couple of months. It's currently being reviewed by the European Parliament and the Council, who have a 2-month scrutiny period when they can make changes or require changes or disagree with the legislative proposals by the Commission. So there is a high likelihood that the PFOA entry will look like this in a couple of months. And this is the change that you will accept higher than the 25 ppb concentration of PFOA contamination, where they are present in fluoride-free firefighting foams and originate from firefighting equipment which has undergone cleaning in accordance with best available techniques. What it means is that if you have a fire truck and you change to fluoride-free foams, but you do not do it using the best available techniques, you don't do the cleaning, the 25 ppb limit value will apply. But if you do the cleaning well, according to these best available techniques, then you can benefit from a higher residual level. It seems a little counterintuitive, like it should be the other way around, but this is really to facilitate companies in doing this transition, because there are lots of unknowns regarding this process. So when the idea for this legislation was drafted, it was thought that, okay, we will have to define the best available technique so that companies and operators who have these foams would know better what is required to benefit from the higher residual level. So there is a group of experts, a consultant hired by the Commission and few member states experts designing and defining what would constitute the best available techniques that is referred to in this upcoming legislation. And this should be adopted in the June meeting of the POPs CAs, so in a couple of months, which is great because the phase out of PFOA will at this rate happen in July, so a month later, but it will also, if this legislation becomes into force, you will have another couple of months until December 3rd, which is the longest possible transition period that we can have according to the Stockholm Convention. So it's the same date as in case presentation earlier in the morning. The guidance is regulating what can be regulated, which means that the POPs in the foams and those POPs that are covered in the upcoming REACH foam restriction. One of the key elements that we have tried to keep in mind when developing this is that this should be enforceable. What it means is that when enforcement officer or enforcement environmental inspector goes to a company, they would have to be able to verify whether the cleanup has been done according to the best available techniques or not. And consequently, that is the defining factor whether your limit value for the residue is 25 ppb or whether it's the 10 milligrams per kilogram. For this work, we have of course looked into the examples from other countries, and as I said earlier, New Zealand and Australia have really been front runners in this work. Melbourne or Victoria Fire and Rescue phased out PFAS containing foams already in 2010, like 15 years ago. And in the EU, we are just basically starting to work on it. But if we look at the key elements in how this has been done in New Zealand expects that when you clean out the residuals of PFAS foams, you do it as far as reasonably practicable, which is a great way of saying that you also take into account the costs of cleaning in this respect. And there is guidance needed on how to do this, but unlike with European Union, New Zealand also put some acceptable residual levels, 50 ppm, 50 milligrams per kilogram, for total PFASs in the system when you move away from PFAS foams to fluorine-free foams. And this is from 2018, so that was the time when you would possibly consider moving away from PFOS and PFOA containing C8 foams to C6 foams, the shorter chain foams. So for this there is a different way of calculating it. And New Zealand also assumed a risk-based approach that you would sort of adjust to different conditions and different systems. As we kind of discussed in my previous presentation, also in New Zealand, the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't regulate wastewater treatment plants, so the wastewater issue is a little difficult. They do have guidance on what you can dispose to wastewaters, and there's a recommended acceptance criteria from them, and these are relatively low, 0.1 micrograms per liter. That's 0.1 ppbs for PFOS and PFOA, and for PFAS total, it's a little higher. In Australia, they have been developing these cleanup systems for a long time. This is from the Fire Rescue Victoria's decontamination projects for fire trucks, and this is also available for everybody who wants to get it. You can get it directly from the Fire Rescue Victoria, or I think it might even be on their website. So they have designed a process for cleaning fire trucks. It's a 32-stage cleaning process, so they are really working on to make them clean. And it includes flushing of the tanks, etc. And what are really difficult, these all sorts of little filters and contactors that you have in a fire truck that you would also have to clean from crystallized PFASs. So it's not only the tank and the pipes, but there are lots of small parts that would have to be cleaned. And here is the appliance decontamination, and Australia has also developed threshold levels for the contamination in this process. But really, originally, when they started this work 15 years ago, they were told that it can't be done, but apparently they are now able to clean these trucks so that you can continue using them with other phones. So this is my second to last slide, and I'm just saying this is perhaps interesting for Ike, more than anybody else, but this is what you can expect, that once this guidance will be adopted, hopefully in June, it's likely that it doesn't prescribe how you should do the cleaning. It doesn't tell you that you have to use triple rinsing, or it doesn't tell you that you have to use a commercial solvent or butylcarbitol to remove the PFAS concentrations. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One thing is that this cleaning process is constantly developing. Companies, when they get more experience and they develop new methods of cleaning. The second thing is that the cleaning system or process that you need to make it clean really depends on the circumstances. It depends on what you had in the system before. Maybe you didn't have any PFAS foam there before, so it would be pointless to require a certain process. So really the questions like also that whether the system is a fixed system or a mobile system like a fire truck, and do you have firewater collection, environmental releases are possible or not, this should be taken into account. We don't yet know how, but these are certain issues that we need to consider. And of course the driving factor here is the rebound, which is the cross-contamination from previous flows. I think we haven't really mentioned it today, but the difficulty here is that when you clean the system up, you will eventually get the cleaning waters that show low concentrations, and then you put the new fluoride-free foam into the system, and it starts leaching the PFAS residues from the surfaces of the pipes and so on, which eventually may mean that the new foam is contaminated above the level. So for cleaning, and this is really interesting, that if you're a stakeholder, if you're an airport or a chemicals industry facility or so, and you hire a company to do the cleaning, you would have to, what the cleaning companies usually say, that it's the customer who decides when to stop. How clean is clean? The customer has to say that this is how low we want you to go with your cleaning process. But the actual requirement should be that the customer should say that you have to clean it so well that these concentration limits will not be exceeded in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. So a lot of things that have to be assumed here. And then one of the things that has to be also thought is like, what sort of analytical requirements do we actually have for the process? Like, when do you have to analyze? Do you have to analyze in a laboratory? And which PFASs do you have to analyze? Do you need to get like indirect methods to analyze the related substances and so on? Some technical considerations, but this is all like consideration. What would be considered best available techniques? And my final slide is this. Like, we don't have answers to these at this point, but really, like, what limit values should be set? I showed you the limit values that New Zealand was using, and earlier we discussed about the issue that we don't really have decent limit values for wastewaters on the EU level. And one of the things that I personally think that should be in this best available techniques, that when you start the process of cleaning, you would end up in a situation where you could estimate the amount of PFAS that is remaining in the system. Because sometimes when we look at these concentrations only, like 25 ppb concentration limit for PFOA, the actual amount, the mass of PFAS that you have remaining in the system could be quite ridiculous. It could be comparable to what you have in an outdoor jacket. So the big question is like, how low do you need to go to prevent releases that are not at all comparable to what you would get from a chromium plating company or some other PFAS uses? What is clear is that when you do the cleanup and when you make choices along the way as you go, this would have to be documented well, because the environmental inspector who will come to the company later on and ask you to show what you have done, how have you cleaned this. They can of course take a sample of the system, but it's unlikely that this would be widely done because each sample is going to cost a lot of money. So they will kind of have to look at it from a theoretical perspective. Have you actually made a decent effort to get rid of the PFAS contamination in the system? And these are really like evolving considerations, and it's really difficult in a way because the legislation is not ready, but the deadlines are coming from Stockholm Convention in the end of this year, and everybody's a little sort of unaware of how good do we have to clean with these. And eventually it's the companies like IKES and it's the fire brigades who do it themselves who kind of take the responsibility. Because at the end of the day, the question is that even if the environmental inspector would not take a sample out of your foam system when you have transitioned to fluoride-free foams, it might well happen when there is a fire and you get the fire waters and then you have an environmental pollution of a lake or groundwater or something, and then they would figure out that, okay, how come there was so much PFOS in your fluoride-free foam? And then it would have implications. I will finish with this. Thank you.